No one imagined the biggest secret in town would arrive on the back of a rusted flatbed truck. The old passenger car groaned as it was lowered onto a forgotten strip of track beside the abandoned Millbrook station. Its windows were cracked, its paint had rotted into streaks of orange rust, and the wooden steps hung loose like broken teeth. A crowd gathered, not to help but to watch, to laugh. $100, someone muttered. They paid $100 for that. Isaiah Brooks didn't look up. He ran his palm along the cold metal siding like he was greeting an old friend nobody else could see. Beside him, his wife Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, smiling in a way that made people uneasy, the smile of someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. "You two have officially lost it," laughed Danny Pratt, a former co-worker of Isaiah's from the auto shop. "You could have bought a Rayall house with that money you spent fixing this thing up." "We didn't buy a house," Evelyn said calmly. "We bought a story." Nobody understood what that meant. Not yet. By nightfall, news had already spread through Millbrook, a town small enough that gossip traveled faster than the trains once did. The local paper ran a tiny mocking headline: "Couple moves into rolling junkyard beside dead railway." A reporter named Casey Lynn snapped a photo of the rusted car with the caption, "Is this town's newest home, or its biggest joke?" Isaiah read the article once, folded the newspaper in half, and set it beneath a table leg to keep it steady. He didn't complain. He didn't argue. He simply got back to work, sanding down the old wooden benches inside the train car by lantern light, long after Evelyn had gone to sleep. What confused people most wasn't that the couple had bought a rusted train car. It was how they were fixing it. Everyone expected them to gut the inside, rip out the old wood, replace it with fresh drywall, maybe add a kitchen island, and call it a modern tiny home. That's what young couples did with old train cars these days. Turn them into trendy campsite rentals with string lights and Wi-Fi. But Isaiah did the opposite. He carefully removed only the rotted sections, preserving as much of the original wood paneling as he could. He polished the brass fixtures instead of replacing them. He kept the old iron luggage racks bolted to the ceiling, the cracked leather seats reupholstered instead of thrown out. It was as if he wasn't building something new. He was protecting something that already existed. "Why don't you just modernize it?" Evelyn's sister Marissa asked one afternoon, watching him work. "It'll sell better if it looks new." "It's not for sale," Isaiah replied simply. It never was. That answer only deepened the confusion. If it wasn't a house, and it wasn't a business, what exactly was it? The mystery grew heavier the following week when Evelyn hung a small handwritten wooden sign on a post outside the train car. Simple black letters, painted with careful strokes. "The station of second chances, opening soon." People stopped their cars just to read it twice. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. A few, like Mayor Grace Whitfield, driving past on her way to a town meeting, slowed down long enough to frown at the sign through her windshield, unsettled by something she couldn't quite name. "Opening soon," Danny repeated when he saw it, nearly choking on his coffee. Opening for what? Nobody's even riding trains here anymore. There hasn't been a working track through Millbrook in almost 40 years. He wasn't wrong. The station had been abandoned since Isaiah was a boy, back when his own father used to bring him here to watch the last of the freight trains rumble through before the line shut down for good. Isaiah never told anyone that detail. Not yet. That night, alone in the train car, Isaiah sat on the floor with a crowbar in his hand, staring at a section of floorboard that didn't sit quite right. It wobbled slightly under his boot, hollow in a way the other boards weren't. Evelyn had gone to grab dinner in town, leaving him alone with nothing but the hum of crickets outside and the creak of old wood settling around him. Curiosity got the better of him. He pried the crowbar beneath the loose plank and pulled. The board lifted with a groan, releasing decades of trapped dust into the lantern light. Isaiah coughed, waving his hand through the cloud, and peered down into the darkness beneath the floor. There, tucked into a hollow compartment built directly into the frame of the train car, sat a weathered leather satchel, cracked with age, tied shut with a frayed string. Beside it lay a small stack of yellowed envelopes, a rusted brass key, and what looked like the corner of a leather-bound journal peeking out from beneath a folded railway blanket. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. Whatever this was, it hadn't been touched in decades. He reached down slowly, fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from something closer to reverence, and lifted the satchel into the lantern light. The moment his fingers brushed the old leather, he knew. Whatever secrets this train car had been hiding, they were about to change everything. Isaiah sat frozen on the cold train car floor, the satchel resting in his lap like it might crumble if he breathed too hard. He didn't call out for Evelyn. He didn't rush. He simply untied the frayed string with careful fingers, watching decades of dust drift off the leather in slow curls under the lantern light. Inside were journals. Not one, 5. Their covers were cracked and faded, the leather soft with age, held together by string binding that had somehow survived the years. Beneath them sat a stack of letters, their envelopes yellowed and brittle, along with a handful of ticket stubs, a stationmaster's brass whistle, and a small collection of black and white photographs showing people Isaiah had never seen before, standing on a platform that looked almost unrecognizable, clean, busy, and full of life. He turned one photograph toward the light. A tall man in a stationmaster's uniform stood proudly beside the very train car Isaiah now called home. Behind him, the platform buzzed with travelers, children waving from windows, porters carrying luggage stacked taller than themselves. Isaiah, Evelyn's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, holding 2 paper bags of takeout, her eyes immediately falling to the open floorboard and the satchel in his hands. "What is all this?" "I don't know yet," Isaiah admitted. "But I think we just became caretakers of something bigger than we planned for." They spent that night on the floor of the train car, the food growing cold beside them, untouched. Evelyn read the first journal aloud by lantern light while Isaiah listened, elbows on his knees, completely still. The handwriting belonged to a man named Walter Reeves, the final stationmaster of Millbrook before the railway shut its doors for good. His journal wasn't filled with schedules or maintenance logs, as Isaiah expected. Instead, it was filled with people. A young soldier boarded car 4 today, saying goodbye to a girl who cried until the train disappeared past the bend. I hope he writes to her. Some don't. An old woman traveled 6 hours just to see her sister one final time before she passed. She missed the burial by 2 days. She sat in the empty church alone and thanked me for at least getting her there in time to grieve properly. A little boy asked me today if trains ever get tired of leaving people behind. I didn't have an answer for him. Page after page, entry after entry, Walter Reeves had quietly documented the private heartbreaks and small joys of every passenger whose story touched his platform. Weddings missed. Reunions celebrated. Apologies delivered just in time. Goodbyes that lasted far longer than the trains themselves. Evelyn's voice grew softer with each passage, until she had to pause, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "These aren't just old papers," she whispered. "These are people's lives." Isaiah nodded slowly, staring at the photograph of Walter Reeves still resting in his palm. There has to be a reason he hid all of this instead of throwing it away when the station closed. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they read letter after letter, journal after journal, piecing together a portrait of a station that had once been the emotional heartbeat of an entire town, long before Millbrook forgot it existed. By sunrise, Evelyn had made a decision. "We're not selling any of this," she said, exhaustion evident in her voice, but her eyes sharp with certainty. "And we're not keeping it locked away, either." Isaiah looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people need to see this. Read this. Feel it the way we just did." She gestured toward the stack of journals scattered across the floor. Walter Reeves spent his whole life collecting stories that mattered to strangers. We can't just let that disappear into a floorboard for another 60 years. Isaiah considered this for a long moment, running his thumb along the cracked spine of the journal in his lap. Slowly, a small smile broke across his tired face, the first real smile Evelyn had seen from him in weeks. "The station of second chances," he murmured, repeating the word from the sign Evelyn had painted days earlier, before either of them even knew what waited beneath the floorboards. "You already knew," Evelyn said, studying his face. "Didn't you? Somehow, some part of you already knew this train car was hiding something." Isaiah shook his head. "No, I just knew it deserved a chance to matter again. I didn't know it would come with proof." Over the following days, their plan began to take shape. Not a home renovation, not a quirky tourist attraction, but something neither of them had words for yet. A place where forgotten stories could breathe again. Where strangers passing through Millbrook might sit for an hour, read a stranger's letter from decades ago, and remember that their own heartbreaks and small victories weren't so different from those who came before them. Isaiah returned to his restoration work with new purpose, treating every plank of wood and rusted bolt like it was part of preserving Walter Reeves' legacy rather than simply fixing an old train car. Evelyn began carefully cataloging the letters and journal entries, deciding which stories would be shared first, imagining small handwritten cards resting beside every table inside the car, each one holding a piece of someone else's life, ready to be discovered by a stranger. Neither of them noticed, in all their excitement, that one journal remained untouched at the bottom of the satchel, its leather cover darker than the rest, its pages thinner, as if it had been read and reread many times before being hidden away. Its first page held only a name, written in shaking handwriting. Marcus Coleman Reed, Porteur, Millbrook Station. Neither of them yet understood how much that single name would come to matter. The morning the station of second chances finally opened, only 4 people showed up. 2 came out of curiosity, 1 came to laugh, and 1 came because she had nowhere else to go. Isaiah had repainted the train car's exterior a deep forest green, careful to preserve the original curved lettering that spelled out Millbrook line along its side. Inside, the seats had been reupholstered in soft burgundy fabric, the brass fixtures polished until they gleamed, and small wooden tables sat where luggage racks once hung empty. On every table sat a single laminated card, a handwritten letter or journal entry from Walter Reeves' collection, paired with a small pot of tea and a slice of homemade pie. Evelyn stood behind a narrow counter at the front of the car, her hands trembling slightly as the first visitor stepped inside. An elderly woman named Ruth Callahan, who had read about the rolling junkyard in a newspaper and decided to see it for herself before it inevitably failed. "What is this supposed to be?" Ruth asked, glancing around at the vintage seats and old photographs mounted on the walls. "A museum? A café?" "Both, in a way," Evelyn said, guiding her to a table near the window. "Read the card first, then let us know what you think." Ruth sat down, skeptical, and unfolded the laminated card resting beside her teacup. It was Walter Reeves' entry about the old woman who traveled 6 hours to see her dying sister, only to arrive 2 days after the funeral. Evelyn watched from the counter as Ruth's expression slowly softened, her hand rising to cover her mouth. By the time she finished reading, tears had gathered in the corners of her eyes. "My husband and I never got to say goodbye to his mother," Ruth whispered almost to herself. "We were 3 hours away when she passed." She stayed for 2 more hours that day, ordering a second pot of tea, quietly reading through 3 more journal entries at neighboring tables. When she finally left, she didn't laugh. She hugged Evelyn at the door and promised to return the following week. Word moved slowly at first, the way small towns always test new things before trusting them. But within 2 weeks, the quiet reading room began attracting a steady trickle of visitors. Travelers passing through on the nearby highway stopped out of curiosity, expecting a novelty roadside attraction, and instead left with damp eyes and full hearts. It was during the 3rd week that Noah Ellery walked through the door. He was 24, a freelance photographer traveling between small towns for a personal project documenting forgotten places across the state. He'd heard about the rusted train car turned cafe from a gas station attendant 30 miles back and decided it might make an interesting photo for his blog. Nothing more. He didn't expect to stay for 6 hours. Noah sat at a corner table, ordered black coffee out of habit, and unfolded the card waiting for him. It was an entry from Walter Reeves describing a young soldier saying goodbye to a girl who cried until the train vanished around the bend. By the time Noah finished reading, his coffee had gone cold, untouched. "This is incredible," he said, catching Isaiah as he passed by refilling teapots. "Do people even know this exists?" "Not many," Isaiah admitted. "Not yet." Noah spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the train car, the sunlight filtering through cracked windows onto the polished brass, Evelyn's careful hands arranging teacups, elderly visitors wiping their eyes over decades-old letters, children pressing their palms against the cool metal walls in quiet wonder. He captured Isaiah kneeling beside the entrance, gently sanding a worn step, sweat dripping down his temple despite the golden afternoon light. That night, Noah posted 12 photographs online with a simple caption. They laughed when this couple moved into a rusted train car. They didn't expect what was hiding inside. By morning, the post had been shared 4,000 times. By the following week, it had reached nearly 200,000 people across the country. Comments flooded in from strangers sharing their own memories of trains, stations, and goodbyes. Some asked where Millbrook was located. Others simply wrote, "I need to see this in person." A woman from 3 states away messaged Noah directly, asking if she could visit and read her grandfather's old letters aloud inside the train car, believing somehow it belonged there. Isaiah and Evelyn watched their quiet reading room transform almost overnight. Cars began lining the gravel road beside the abandoned station. More visitors in a single weekend than Millbrook had seen from outsiders in years. Local diners reported longer lines. The old gas station near the highway suddenly needed to restock twice as often. But not everyone in town celebrated the sudden attention. Standing near the edge of the growing crowd one Saturday afternoon, Mayor Grace Whitfield watched with a tight, uneasy expression as strangers wandered freely across the old railway property. Property she quietly worried had never been properly inspected for safety since the station's closure decades earlier. And further down Main Street, inside his newly opened real estate office, developer Marcus Reed watched the same viral photographs on his laptop screen, his jaw tightening as he read the caption beneath Noah's final image. He said nothing to his assistant standing beside him. He simply closed the laptop, stood, and stared out his office window toward the distant train car, glowing faintly under the afternoon sun, as if it had just become a problem he intended to solve. Within a month, Millbrook looked like a different town. Cars lined the gravel road leading to the old station every weekend. A food truck had parked permanently near the entrance, selling coffee to the crowds waiting for a table inside the train car. The hardware store sold out of postcards featuring Noah's photographs, printed without permission, but nobody seemed to mind. Even Ruth Callahan had taken to greeting visitors at the door on Saturdays, proudly calling herself the unofficial welcoming committee. For shop owners like Danny Pratt, the change was good news. His auto shop now serviced twice as many out-of-town vehicles, and the diner next door had extended its hours to catch the overflow crowd. "Guess the joke's on us," Danny admitted to Isaiah one afternoon, dropping off a toolbox Isaiah had borrowed weeks earlier. "Never thought I'd say this, but that rusty old car is the best thing that's happened to this town in years." Not everyone agreed. Some residents complained about the traffic clogging the narrow road each weekend. Others worried about strangers wandering freely across an abandoned railway property that hadn't been inspected in decades. A few simply resented the attention, uncomfortable with their quiet, forgotten town suddenly appearing in strangers' photographs online. Mayor Grace Whitfield found herself caught in the middle of it all. She'd known Isaiah since he was a boy, watching trains pass through with his father before the line shut down. She didn't want to be the reason something meaningful was taken away from the community. But she also carried the weight of genuine concern. Old wooden platforms, unstable tracks, a structure never legally rezoned for public gatherings. "I need to see your permits," she told Isaiah and Evelyn during an unannounced visit one Tuesday morning, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. "Fire safety, structural inspection, occupancy limits. All of it. We didn't think we needed permits for a reading room," Evelyn said carefully. You do now, Grace replied, not unkindly. Because it isn't just a reading room anymore. It's practically a tourist attraction pulling in hundreds of people a week. Isaiah and Evelyn spent the following days scrambling to gather paperwork, hire an inspector, and address safety concerns they hadn't anticipated needing to solve. It cost money they didn't have, time they couldn't spare, and stress that settled heavily across Isaiah's shoulders each night. But the permits were only the beginning of their problems. 3 days after Grace's visit, a slick advertisement appeared in the local paper, a full-page announcement from Reed Development Group, featuring polished renderings of modern townhouses, complete with a manicured park and a fountain where the old station currently stood. Millbrook deserves progress. Millbrook deserves a future. Marcus Reed had officially announced his plan to purchase the entire railway corridor, arguing that the abandoned property represented wasted potential, land that could house dozens of families, create construction jobs, and bring lasting economic growth to a town that had quietly struggled since the railway closed decades earlier. Nostalgia doesn't pay property taxes, Marcus told a local news reporter outside his office, his tone smooth and confident. I understand people love a good story, but stories don't build schools or fix roads. Progress does. The article spread through town almost as fast as Noah's photographs had weeks earlier. Except this time, it split Millbrook cleanly in two. Some residents agreed with Marcus, tired of watching their town shrink year after year while nearby cities flourished. Others were furious, accusing him of trying to erase the very history that had finally brought life back to Millbrook. A heated town meeting erupted the following week, with residents shouting over one another in the community hall, some demanding the council protect the station, others insisting the town couldn't survive on sentiment alone. Isaiah sat quietly near the back, Evelyn's hand gripped tightly in his own, listening as strangers argued about the fate of something they had rebuilt with nothing but $100 and countless sleepless nights. You don't understand what's inside that train car, Evelyn finally said, standing when the shouting reached its peak. The room fell into an uneasy silence. It's not just old wood and rusted metal. It's people's lives. Real letters, real journals, real heartbreak, and hope from families who once called this station home. You can't put a price tag on that. Marcus, seated near the front, turned slightly in his chair. With respect, Mrs. Brooks, sentiment doesn't keep a town alive. Jobs do. Homes do. The meeting ended without resolution, the council promising to review all proposals before making a final decision. But the divide in Millbrook had already deepened, neighbors avoiding each other at the grocery store, old friendships strained by opposing yard signs sprouting along Main Street, some reading Save Our Station, others declaring support progress. That night, back inside the quiet train car, Isaiah sat alone among the empty tables, staring at Walter Reeves' final untouched journal, the one belonging to Marcus Coleman Reed, still unread at the bottom of the satchel. He hadn't made the connection yet. Not fully. Not until he noticed, tucked into the journal's back cover, a faded photograph of a young black porter standing beside the very same developer's family name stitched into a company payroll ledger from decades earlier. Isaiah's hands went still. Somehow, impossibly, the story hidden beneath his floorboards and the man, threatening to bulldoze it away, were connected by something far older than either of them realized. Evelyn found Isaiah still sitting among the empty tables when she returned to the train car past midnight, the last untouched journal open in his lap, a single lantern casting long shadows across his face. "You should be asleep," she said gently, sliding into the seat across from him. "Look at this," Isaiah said instead, sliding the journal toward her along with the faded photograph tucked in its back cover. Evelyn studied the picture, a young black man in a porter's uniform, standing stiffly beside the very train car they now called home, his eyes steady but guarded. Beneath the photograph, a payroll ledger page had been carefully folded and preserved, listing employee names in faded ink. Her finger stopped on one line, M. Reed, Porter, terminated 1961. Reed, Evelyn whispered. Like Marcus Reed. I don't know yet, Isaiah admitted, but I think we need to find out. They spent that night reading the final journal cover to cover. Not Walter Reeves' handwriting this time, but a different voice entirely, written in careful, deliberate script that grew shakier with each passing entry. The journal belonged to Marcus Coleman Reed, a young porter who had worked the Millbrook line for nearly 4 years. His early entries were hopeful, even proud, describing his work helping passengers with luggage, learning schedules by heart, saving carefully toward night classes he hoped would one day lead him into a station master role, a rare achievement for a black man in that era. Mr. Reeves says I have a good mind for this work. Says maybe someday I could run a station of my own. I don't tell him how much that means to me. I write it here instead. But later entries grew heavier, filled with quiet humiliations. Passengers who refused his help without explanation, supervisors who overlooked him for promotions given instead to less experienced white employees, small cruelties stacked one atop another until they became unbearable weight. Turn away from the promotion again today. Same excuse. Not yet ready. I have been ready for 2 years. I begin to wonder if ready is a word that will ever apply to me here. The final entry, dated just weeks before his termination, ended abruptly mid-sentence. The ink smudged as though the pen had been pressed too hard before stopping entirely. I don't know how much longer I can keep believing this station will ever see me the way it sees everyone. Nothing followed. No closing thought. No resolution. Just silence, preserved beneath decades of dust. Evelyn closed the journal slowly, her hands trembling. What happened to him? Isaiah didn't answer right away. He was staring at the payroll ledger again, at the single word beside Marcus Reed's name, terminated. Over the following days, Isaiah buried himself in local archives, county records, and old newspaper microfilm at the tiny Millbrook Library, determined to uncover what had become of the young porter whose voice had gone silent so abruptly decades earlier. What he found surprised him more than he expected. Marcus Coleman Reed hadn't disappeared into obscurity after losing his job at the station. Records showed he'd moved 2 counties over, eventually opening a small but successful hardware and lumber supply business, Reed & Sons Building Supply, that had grown steadily over the following decades, passed down through 3 generations of his family. Isaiah's breath caught as he traced the family name forward through property records, business licenses, and finally, a modern real estate development firm registered under the same family lineage. Reed Development Group. Marcus Reed, the developer threatening to bulldoze the very station that had once discarded his own grandfather, was Marcus Coleman Reed's direct descendant. Isaiah sat motionless in the library for nearly 20 minutes after realizing it, staring at the connection linking past and present in a way neither he nor Evelyn could have imagined when they first pried open that hollow floorboard. He didn't tell Evelyn right away. He wasn't sure how. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, honoring the story itself. Together, they built a small dedicated corner inside the train car, a section unlike any other table in the reading room. Instead of a single laminated card, they created a full display. Marcus Coleman Reed's photograph, his final unfinished journal entry framed beside it, and a short written history explaining both his hardship and his quiet, determined success afterward. A man who had been discarded by one institution only to build something lasting entirely on his own. Visitors who reached that corner often stayed the longest, reading the unfinished sentence again and again, moved by its abrupt, painful silence far more than any completed story could have achieved. "It's the not knowing," Ruth Callahan said one afternoon, standing before the display with tears in her eyes. You want so badly for him to finish that sentence, for someone, anyone, to tell him it got better. Isaiah, standing quietly nearby, finally understood what he needed to do. The following morning, he drove to Marcus Reed's office, the framed final journal entry tucked carefully beneath his arm, unsure whether he was about to defuse the conflict tearing Millbrook apart, or ignite something far more complicated than either of them had bargained for. Marcus Reed's office smelled like fresh paint and ambition. Glass desks, city renderings pinned along the walls, nothing that hinted at the past Isaiah now carried beneath his arm. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus said, glancing up from his laptop, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." Isaiah didn't sit down. He simply placed the framed journal entry on the desk between them, the unfinished sentence facing Marcus directly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep believing the station will ever see me the way it sees everyone." Marcus's expression shifted the moment he read the names signed at the bottom. "Where did you find this?" "Beneath the floorboards of the train car you're trying to bulldoze," Isaiah said quietly. "He was your grandfather, wasn't he?" The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Marcus stared at the photograph, his confident posture slowly softening into something Isaiah hadn't expected to witness: quiet, uncertain grief. "My father never talked about him much," Marcus finally admitted. "Just said his own father worked the railway once before starting the business. I didn't know any of this." Isaiah left the framed entry with him, saying nothing more. He didn't ask Marcus to abandon his development plans. He simply wanted him to understand what stood on that land before deciding its fate. But understanding, Isaiah would soon learn, didn't always change decisions made under financial pressure. 2 weeks later, Marcus doubled down publicly, announcing an even larger offer to the town council, promising new jobs, tax revenue, and modern housing that Millbrook's shrinking population desperately needed. Whatever quiet moment had passed between them in that office apparently hadn't been enough to outweigh the momentum of his business plans. Meanwhile, inside the train car, Isaiah's own battle had begun waging silently in his hands. The arthritis had crept into his fingers gradually over the past year, but the endless restoration work, sanding, hammering, polishing brass fixtures late into the night, had accelerated it faster than he wanted to admit. Some mornings, he woke unable to fully close his right hand, forced to soak it in warm water before he could even hold a paintbrush steady. He told no one, not Evelyn, not Ruth, certainly not the growing crowd of visitors who saw only his calm, steady presence each weekend. "You're limping," Evelyn noted one evening, watching him climb down from the train car's steps more carefully than usual. "Old boots," Isaiah lied, forcing a smile. "Need new soles." She didn't push further, though something in her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe him. Isaiah told himself he wasn't hiding his condition out of pride. He simply refused to let anything slow down what they'd built, not when so much depended on finishing it properly. Not when Marcus Reed's offer still loomed over the council's upcoming decision. Unbeknownst to Isaiah, Evelyn had quietly begun solving a problem of her own. Realizing they couldn't maintain the growing station and its surrounding gardens alone, she started reaching out, first to Ruth Callahan, then to retired railway workers who remembered the station's glory days, then eventually to local carpenters and even a handful of college students home for summer break, eager to be part of something meaningful. Slowly, a volunteer community began forming around the station, restoring the crumbling platform boards, planting flower beds along the walkway, repainting the old signage that once welcomed travelers decades earlier. Even Danny Pratt showed up one Saturday, tools in hand, muttering something about making up for all those years of laughing before disappearing beneath the platform to fix a rotted support beam. Perhaps most surprising of all was Casey Lynn, the same reporter who'd once mocked the couple's rolling junkyard in print. She arrived one afternoon, not with a notepad, but with gardening gloves, quietly apologizing to Evelyn before spending the day planting rows of marigolds along the station's entrance. "I was wrong," Casey admitted simply. "I didn't understand what this place would become." The growing volunteer effort gave Isaiah a newfound hope, even as his physical condition continued declining behind the scenes. He pushed through the pain, refusing to slow his pace, convincing himself that stopping now, even briefly, might somehow unravel everything they'd built. Meanwhile, Marcus increased pressure from a different direction entirely. Rather than waiting for the council's decision, he began privately meeting with individual council members, offering substantial investment commitments contingent on approving his development plans swiftly, investments that promised new roads, updated water systems, and modernized schools that Millbrook genuinely needed. Mayor Grace found herself torn between two futures for her town, one built on preserving forgotten history, the other on tangible infrastructure improvements her constituents desperately required. "I don't envy your decision," she admitted to her assistant one evening, staring at Marcus's latest proposal spread across her desk. "Whichever way this goes, someone in this town loses something that matters." As the council's scheduled hearing date approached, Isaiah worked later into each night despite Evelyn's growing concern, his hands aching, his steps slower, his exhaustion deepening with every passing week. He didn't know it yet, but the hearing meant to decide the station's fate would arrive at the exact moment his own body finally reached its breaking point, forcing a truth he'd hidden from everyone straight into the open at the worst possible time. The night before the hearing, Isaiah collapsed. It happened quietly, without warning. He was locking up the train car after a long day of cleaning, reaching up to fasten the old brass latch on the door, when a sharp pain shot through his hand and up his arm, buckling his knees beneath him. He caught himself against the doorframe, breathing hard, sweat breaking across his forehead despite the cool evening air. Evelyn found him sitting on the platform steps 20 minutes later, pale and shaking, unable to fully straighten his right hand. "How long?" she asked, kneeling beside him, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and quiet anger. "How long has this been happening, Isaiah?" "A while," he admitted finally, too exhausted to keep lying. "Since before Noah's photos went viral." "Maybe longer. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was scared that if I stopped to deal with it, we'd never finish. That everything we built would fall apart before it even had a chance." Evelyn helped him inside, wrapped his hand in a warm cloth, and sat beside him in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "You already built something that matters, Isaiah. Whatever happens tomorrow at that hearing, win or lose, you don't have to prove anything else. Not to this town. Not to me." The following evening, Millbrook's community hall filled beyond capacity for the council's final hearing. Residents packed into rows of folding chairs, spilling into the aisles and doorway, phones raised to record whatever was about to unfold. Marcus Reed sat near the front, calm and composed, a folder of updated proposals resting on his lap. Mayor Grace sat at the council table, flanked by 4 other members, gaveling the meeting to order amid a restless murmur of voices. "This hearing," Grace announced, "will determine the future of the Millbrook Railway property, whether it will be sold to Reed Development Group for residential construction or preserved as a protected community site." Marcus stood first, delivering a polished, confident presentation. New housing renderings, projected tax revenue, promises of modernized infrastructure that would finally reverse Millbrook's decades-long decline. Several council members nodded along, clearly persuaded by numbers that were difficult to argue against. When it was their turn, Isaiah and Evelyn didn't stand at the podium with charts or statistics. Instead, Isaiah rose slowly, his bandaged hand tucked against his side, and made a simple request. "We're not going to give you a speech," he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Instead, we'd like to invite everyone in this room, council members included, to spend just one evening inside the train car before this vote happens. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Right now." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the hall. Marcus frowned, clearly caught off guard by the unconventional request. Grace hesitated, glancing at her fellow council members, before finally nodding. "1 hour," she said. "Then we return here to vote." What followed became something none of them expected. The train car, lit softly with lanterns and string lights along the platform, welcomed nearly 40 people that evening. Council members, longtime residents, skeptics, and supporters alike, crowding gently into seats meant for a fraction of that number. Evelyn guided them table by table, letting each person choose a journal entry or letter to read quietly for themselves. An elderly council member named Harold Whitmore sat near the window, reading Walter Reed's account of a mother reuniting with a son believed lost during wartime deployment. By the time he finished, his hands were trembling, his eyes wet behind his glasses. "My own father came home on a train just like this one," he said quietly to no one in particular. I haven't thought about that in 30 years. Near the back, Ruth Callahan sat beside a young council aide, sharing her own story of her husband's mother, the goodbye they never properly got to say. Across the aisle, Casey Lynn, now more volunteer than reporter, guided a skeptical resident toward the section dedicated to Marcus Coleman Reed, watching quietly as his expression shifted from doubt to something closer to reflection. Even Marcus Reed, seated stiffly near the entrance, eventually rose from his chair and walked toward his grandfather's memorial corner. He stood there for a long time, reading the unfinished sentence again, his jaw tightening, something visibly shifting behind his composed exterior. Mayor Grace watched all of this unfold from a quiet corner booth, an untouched letter resting in her lap. One written by a young widow thanking Walter Reeves for personally delivering news of her husband's return, rather than leaving it to an impersonal telegram. She hadn't expected the story to move her the way it did. When the hour ended, the room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence as everyone slowly filed back toward the community hall for the final vote. Grace stood at the front once more, gripping the podium, visibly wrestling with the decision ahead of her. I came into this hearing believing progress and preservation were opposites, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. I'm not entirely certain of that anymore. Marcus Reed, seated in the front row, said nothing. But for the first time since announcing his development plans, his confident posture had entirely disappeared, replaced by something far more uncertain. As if the man responsible for potentially destroying the station wasn't entirely sure anymore which outcome he truly wanted. The vote took less than 10 minutes, though it felt to Isaiah like the longest 10 minutes of his life. Grace called for a show of hands after brief, closing statement for both sides. Marcus, when given the chance to speak once more, surprised the entire room by saying very little. I came here tonight ready to fight for progress, he admitted, standing slowly. But I just spent an hour inside a place that held my grandfather's pain and my family's forgotten beginning. I'm not asking the council to reject my original proposal entirely. I'm asking them to consider something different, a compromise. Development around the station, not instead of it. Gasps rippled through the room. Isaiah exchanged a stunned glance with Evelyn, neither of them expecting such a shift. After a brief, hushed deliberation, the council voted 4-1 in favor of permanently protecting the station and train car as a designated community heritage site, while allowing Marcus Reed to proceed with a scaled-back housing development on the outer edge of the railway corridor, far enough removed to preserve the station's integrity, close enough to bring the economic benefits Millbrook needed. The community hall erupted into applause, some residents openly crying, others embracing neighbors they'd argued with for weeks. Isaiah felt his knees weaken with relief, Evelyn's arm the only thing keeping him steady as Ruth Callahan rushed forward, hugging them both fiercely. But even amid the celebration, Isaiah's body had reached its limit. 2 days later, a doctor's visit confirmed what Isaiah had feared for months: advanced arthritis compounded by months of relentless, uninterrupted labor. The diagnosis wasn't life-threatening, but came with a firm warning. Continued strain without rest could permanently damage his hands beyond repair. You need to slow down, the doctor said plainly. Whatever you're building, it isn't worth losing the use of your hands entirely. Isaiah left the appointment quieter than usual, staring out the truck window as Evelyn drove them home. There's one more thing I want to finish, he said eventually. After that, I promise I'll rest. Weeks earlier, before the hearing had consumed their attention, Isaiah had reached out to the Regional Railway Heritage Museum with a request that seemed, at the time, more dream than reality. Permission to temporarily attach their restored train car to a working heritage steam locomotive for a single ceremonial journey along a preserved stretch of historic track just outside Millbrook. To everyone's surprise, the museum agreed, moved by Noah's viral photographs and the story that had captured attention far beyond their small town. The ceremonial journey was scheduled for the following Saturday, timed perfectly with a town celebration marking the council's decision to protect the station permanently. Despite Evelyn's worry over his health, Isaiah insisted on personally overseeing the final preparations, checking every bolt securing the train car to the antique locomotive, inspecting the wheels one last time, running his aching hands along the freshly painted exterior with quiet pride. "This is the last big thing," he promised Evelyn, noticing her concerned expression. "After this, I'll rest. I mean it this time." Saturday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm sunshine, as if the weather itself understood the significance of the day. Hundreds of residents lined the preserved railway corridor hours before the scheduled departure, children waving small paper flags, vendors selling lemonade and sandwiches along the gravel path, Noah weaving through the crowd with his camera, capturing every excited face. At exactly 2 o'clock, the Heritage steam locomotive's whistle pierced the afternoon air, drawing gasps and cheers from the assembled crowd. Slowly, with a deep mechanical groan that echoed across the valley, the restored train car began to move. For the first time in over 60 years, rolling gently along tracks it once traveled daily before Millbrook forgot its own history. Isaiah stood just inside the open door of the car, gripping the frame tightly, watching decades of memories come alive around him. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand resting over his bandaged fingers, both of them silent as the crowd's cheers grew louder with every passing yard. Along the route, residents ran alongside the slow-moving train, waving handkerchiefs and calling out congratulations. Ruth Callahan stood near the old platform, tears streaming freely down her face as the car passed by, whispering something Isaiah couldn't quite hear over the wind. Danny Pratt stood atop his truck bed further down the track, filming the moment on his phone, grinning wider than anyone remembered seeing him smile before. Even Marcus Reed appeared near the halfway point of the route, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, watching the train car, his grandfather's story, quite literally, roll past him with dignity restored. As the train completed its slow, ceremonial loop and began approaching the station once more, Isaiah felt something shift deep within him. Not just relief, but a quiet, overwhelming sense of completion. Whatever pain remained in his hands, whatever exhaustion weighed on his body, none of it mattered in this single, perfect moment. "We did it," Evelyn whispered beside him, her voice thick with emotion as the crowd's cheering swelled to its loudest point yet. Isaiah nodded, unable to speak past the lump rising in his throat, watching Millbrook's forgotten station finally receive the celebration it had waited 60 long years to deserve. What had once been mocked as a $100 rolling junkyard had become, in that singular golden afternoon, an undeniable symbol of pride, resilience, and second chances. Not just for Isaiah and Evelyn, but for an entire town that had nearly let its own history slip away. 6 months after the ceremonial journey, the Millbrook Town Council issued a permanent heritage designation for the station and surrounding railway corridor, a legal protection ensuring no future developer, no matter how persuasive or well-funded, could ever threaten the property again. Marcus Reed's scaled-back housing project broke ground quietly on the corridor's outer edge that same spring, close enough to bring new families and fresh tax revenue into Millbrook, far enough to leave the station and its stories undisturbed. Marcus himself became an unexpected fixture at the station in the months that followed. He funded a small bronze plaque near his grandfather's memorial corner, engraved simply with the words, "Marcus Coleman Reed." He believed someone would finally listen. He visited most Sundays, often bringing his own children to sit quietly beside the unfinished journal entry, teaching them a piece of family history he hadn't known himself until a rusted train car forced it back into the light. Isaiah, following his doctor's firm instructions, finally allowed himself to slow down. He handed much of the daily restoration work over to the growing volunteer community. Danny Pratt now unofficially in charge of structural repairs, Casey Lynn managing the station's small garden and seasonal plantings, and a rotating group of local teenagers trained by Ruth Callahan to guide visitors through the station's growing collection of stories. Noah Ellery, whose photographs had first carried Millbrook's story far beyond its borders, returned to the station nearly a year after his initial visit. this time with a publishing contract in hand. His photo book, The Station of Second Chances, released the following spring, climbing steadily onto bestseller lists across the country. Profits from the book funded further restoration efforts, along with scholarships for local students pursuing trades like carpentry and historical preservation, ensuring Millbrook's next generation carried forward the same values Isaiah had quietly modeled from the very beginning. The station itself continued evolving, though never losing the heart of what it had always been. What began as a single reading room eventually expanded into a modest but beloved cultural center. Monthly storytelling nights where residents shared their own family histories aloud, a small stage added for local musicians, an annual heritage festival each autumn drawing visitors from neighboring counties eager to experience the now-famous train car for themselves. Evelyn, still cataloging news stories that occasionally surfaced from other forgotten corners of the railway property, often found herself standing near the original entrance, watching new visitors step through the doorway for the very first time, always slightly skeptical, always leaving profoundly changed. "It never gets old," she admitted to Isaiah one quiet evening, watching a young couple read Walter Reeve account of the soldier's tearful goodbye, the same story that had first moved Ruth Callahan years earlier. Watching people realize this place is more than what they expected. Isaiah, seated beside her on the old platform bench, nodded slowly, his once aching hands now steadier after months of careful rest, though a permanent stiffness remained, a quiet reminder of everything the project had cost him and everything it had ultimately given back in return. Walter Reeve spent his whole life believing strangers' stories mattered, Isaiah said. I think he'd be glad to know he was right. Years passed gently after that. Isaiah eventually retired fully from daily station work, content to spend his mornings tending the flower beds Casey had first planted, or sitting quietly near Marcus Coleman, Reeves Memorial Corner, watching new generations discover the unfinished sentence that had once changed everything. Mayor Grace Whitfield, reflecting during her final term in office, often credited the station's preservation as the turning point that taught Millbrook an important lesson, that progress and history weren't always opposing forces, but could instead grow together when a community chose understanding over division. The abandoned station that had once sat forgotten and rusting beside empty tracks became, in time, the very heart of Millbrook itself. Its once mocked $100 train car, now recognized nationally as a powerful symbol of resilience, remembrance, and the quiet dignity of overlooked lives finally given their due. Visitors continued arriving from all across the country, many returning year after year, bringing their own letters, journals, and family stories to add to the station's ever-growing collection, a living archive built not by historians or institutions, but by ordinary people who understood, the moment they stepped inside, exactly what Isaiah and Evelyn had recognized from the very beginning. That forgotten places, like forgotten people, always deserve a second chance. And long after the laughter that once greeted their rusted train car had faded entirely from memory, replaced instead by generations of gratitude, Millbrook's station of second chances remained exactly what Walter Reeve's hidden journals had always promised it could become. Not simply a monument to the past, but a living, breathing reminder that even the smallest, most unexpected beginnings can grow into something an entire community carries forward together for generations still to come.